The devil strips us of our humanity, and all that remains is an animal. These are the last words my father told me before he killed himself. Intense, I know, but the story is an intense one. Let me start by saying this is happening somewhere in a place you heard of. I won't tell you exactly the location. Just know you might have heard about it in the news. But it being described as a completely different situation. I started a podcast. One where I spoke my mind of how I saw the world. And now, I think I've started the end times. Let me start from the beginning. I guess it's a story as old as time. Young boy grows up in an abusive household, only to grow up feeling alienated by the world. Throw in a montage of sad music and, well, that describes my life. I was not a happy kid. My parents constantly argued. Sometimes the fights were harmless, and other times they were right down vicious. Though, it was just our way of life. And for the most part, I lived with that cloud of anger hovering over me without a glitch. While most kids my age were learning about the joy of living, I was too busy discovering how depraved humans could be by observing my parents. My father was an alcoholic. There's not a time I don't remember him not having a drink in his hand. Sometimes it would be beer. And then there was whiskey. Whiskey. A scent that I've grown to despise. Fragments of my father's image haunt me anytime I get a whiff of the disgusting poison. Most times my father would come home from work trying his best to pick a fight with my mother over the most benign reasons. He would parade around the house brushing his fingers across our polished furniture in hopes of finding any evidence of dust, giving him a reason to yell at her. The whole thing made me sick. I was too small to fend him off, so honestly, most of the time I would hide. Especially anytime he would slap my mother. The sound of skin whipping against each other has to be one of the most grotesque noises one could hear. The horrid sound still sends chills up my spine. My father was a big man. His mere presence terrified me. Luckily, those beatings were only reserved for my mother. He hardly ever touched me. At times, it almost felt as my mom was my own personal whipping boy. Though, I could see how much my dad truly despised me. Anytime he would look at me, pure rage would be evident in his eyes. An abysmal snarl would usually follow his words whenever talking to me. From what I could tell, he wished I wasn't born. "You're an animal," is what he would usually tell me. He thought of me as an animal. Something less than human. Though, he treated our dog better than he did me. Funny enough, my father was a well-respected man in our community. He was a local repairman. A jack of all trades, so to speak. But mainly, he was an electrician. Something he taught me to do at an early age. In fact, my parents pulled me out of school to home tutor me in attempts for me to help my father at times. I remember being 10 years old and being shocked by 120 volts to the point that I passed out. When I came to, I remember crying profusely at how bad my arm hurt, only for my father to scoff. My mother was not that much better. In fact, I would say she was a lot worse. The beatings that she took in my place would still reach me by her own hand. She was frustrated with life. I could see the defeat in her eyes only intensify with each passing day. But even more devastating was her youth too was slowly slipping away. My mom had always been a beautiful woman. To this day, I still don't know how my father ever ended up with her. Persistence, I suppose. Either way, an emotional connection was never established, and all they ever had were heartaches for one another. Each day after my father would leave to work, she would come to my room, screaming at me for the smallest of things. This usually led to a beating, something I grew numb to. I believe it was because of how much I resembled my father. I suppose this was her one way at getting back at the man that had imprisoned her. Though, that wasn't the most alarming thing she would do to me. No. For whatever reason, she liked to dress me up like a girl when my father was at work. And if I didn't agree, well, she would pull out the belt. I don't know why she did. Maybe she had wanted a daughter. Maybe she detested men because of people like my father. Perhaps I would never know the true reason other than lunacy. Once my father came home early while I was still wearing my blue pinafore dress with a white apron. The one that Alice wore when falling down the rabbit hole. For whatever reason, my mother was enthralled with that story. Maybe she found solace in the idea of escape through the wondrous world of Wonderland. I wouldn't know. That day was one of the rare occasions that my father put his hands on me, and I suffered the most horrendous beating of my life. After that, I made sure to constantly check the driveway for my dad's car, not wanting to be caught wearing my dress again. The shambles of my life pushed me to the edge of darkness, and I entertained the most dreadful thoughts of how I could end it all. To add to my torment was the hideous habit my father had of watching me sleep. His heavy breathing would always awake me in the middle of the night. Mangled wheezing of him gasping out for air would inundate my small room. When he first started doing this, I would turn to him, horrified as he sat in the darkened corner, his menacing silhouette devouring any nearby light. When he realized I could see him, he would then do the most horrific thing. He would smile. An image forever burned into my retinas. I would quickly bury my head underneath my covers, pretending that I didn't see him. After a while, whenever I would awake to the sounds of his ghastly wheezing, I would just squeeze my eyes tightly shut, hoping by some terrifying chance he would not pry them open, forcing me to see that abhorrent smile. I think he knew when I was awake. He would walk over to the bed and hover above. I remember feeling his hot breath permeate over the covers, his stench practically causing me to gag. Sometimes he would make the most disturbing noises when he would linger over me. It sounded like pig noises, like snorting, something you would hear in a farm. And once I felt him lick me through the covers, his tongue feeling unnaturally long and thin. I asked my father once why he would watch me sleep. He looked at me confused and told me I must have been dreaming, but then laughed, sending shockwaves down his gut. His confounded expression dropped, morphing into a devious grin, telling me I was an animal, and animals don't dream. This went on for years. The collective mind of insanity accumulated in the corners of my home as both my mom and dad seemed to take chunks out of my life each day. It didn't matter how much I prayed or pleaded. No one came to help. And thoughts of escaping swirled around my head almost on a daily basis, venturing into the unknown world of the living. As I entered my teen years, my mother only became more psychotic, wandering around the house almost as if she was lost. By this point, she had hardly did any cleaning, and I spent most of the day doing all of her chores, not wanting my father to be enraged. A lot of times I would catch her just staring at a mirror, sometimes the one in our restroom, and other times the one in her bedroom. The closer I would approach, I would hear her talking to herself, mumbling incoherently as if having a conversation with her reflection. Once she saw me and pulled me into her world, forcing me to look at the mirror. All I saw was our reflection. She told me to look closer. that if I just opened my eyes, I would see him. Who him was, I didn't know. But I remember being so scared in that moment. Frightened at her gripping my shoulder tightly. Frightened that whatever she was seeing would see me. But truthfully, I was still more terrified of my father coming home early and seeing me in my blue dress. Shortly after that moment, my mother started bringing men home while my father was at work. She would introduce them to me as friends. After a quick hello, she would pull them into the bedroom. The sounds that would follow burrowed deep into my memories. Sounds of grotesque moans fluttered in the air that could only be described as animals engaging in lustful acts, all while the smell of sweat and skin simmered in the confines of my nostrils. I thought of what my father would think, or worse, what he would do. I prayed for the men to vanish. I pleaded for it all to end. And by some magic, the men did just that. They would disappear, never leaving from where they entered. I scratched my head of how my mom was performing such an illusion. Was she hiding the men in the walls? Keeping them hidden for a lonely day? Of course not, I thought to myself. Most likely they would escape through the window. Maybe she didn't want the neighbors to see them leave. But then again, the entire neighborhood could clearly see them enter. I pondered if I should tell my father what was happening. Maybe he could make it stop. Perhaps he could literally slap some sense into my mother. But I was too much of a coward to ever confront my dad. By the time I reached my late teen years, I found comfort in wearing my blue pinafore dress. My mother didn't even bother forcing me to wear it. Instead, I would dress up in my room whenever I had a moment to myself. My mother continued having affairs. Men entering but never leaving. I would put on my noise-canceling headphones anytime a new man would arrive. The animal noises that they would make only became more hideous. At this time, she had practically decorated all of our walls with mirrors. We must have had at least 6 mirrors in each room. Some small, and others large enough to see your entire body. I grew to despise women because of her, even though I never met another one in my life. I assumed they were all the same. And thinking deeper about it, I came to the conclusion that my father was right. We are all animals. I don't know if it was guilt, or perhaps hatred for my mother, but I have finally worked up the courage to tell my father about the affairs. His menacing presence only diminished the bigger I grew, me virtually reaching his eye level by the time I was 16. I searched for him one night, now ready to unleash the devastating truth to him, understanding it would not end well for her, but at the same time, knowing such news will only hurt my dad as well. It was a win-win for me. I scoured around our home looking for him. Finally, I had found him in the dining room. All the lights to the house were off. His oversized silhouette presenting itself in the dimly lit room. I could see his back was turned to me. I thought this was the best time. I didn't want to see the monster in his eyes come to life. I just wanted to say my piece and be done with it. I stepped closer, holding my breath, contemplating on how to start, but before I could say a word, I heard it. That wheezing. The frail gasps for air that have plagued my nights for the last 16 years. I narrowed my eyes and looked carefully through the darkness, focusing in on the man that I hated. And to my horror, he started to move around frantically, jiving his head in movements I don't ever remember seeing my father do. Like some broken action figure, he twisted his head 180 degrees. His back still turned to me, but now I was face to face with him. And like all those nights when he would see me looking at him, he smiled. His sinister grin lighting a flame of pure fear inside of me. My stomach sinking to the floor. All of the courage that I had mere minutes ago dissipated into the realm of nothingness as I stood frozen from terror, not knowing what I was seeing. My father then reached out his arms as if he wanted to hold me, but then started to make those dreadful pig noises, snorting uncontrollably, still cracking his neck into different angles that shouldn't be possible. That's when I realized it wasn't my father I was looking at. No, it was one of those appalling mirrors. Whatever this thing was, it was not my dad. I picked up the nearest object and threw it towards the mirror with such vigor, it shattering into a million pieces. But I then heard the monster scream out in agony, the sounds only strengthening as each shard fell to the floor, transitioning into an unsolvable puzzle. That's when I realized the screaming was not coming from that thing, but from my parents' bedroom. Bang! A gunshot rung out through the house, startling me, causing me to take cover behind a small chair. Then, again, bang! I remained crouched down in the darkness, trying my best to stay hidden as my brain processed what was happening. I could hear a bit of thunder cautiously begin outside as tiny drops of rain fell down to the earth, colliding onto our windows. The cracking sound of the storm soothed my soul as my eyes scanned around for anything or anyone, especially that beast. That's when I saw my father come down the stairs, stepping carelessly, not worried about missing a step, aimlessly heading towards our front door. He was still wearing his pajamas. I could see they were stained with some crimson fluid, its red almost glowing in the darkness. I could vividly see he was holding something in his hand. He stepped out into the storm, not acknowledging the dire onslaught of heavy rain, and wandered out into the front yard. I got up and walked towards the door, feeling apprehensive if he really was my father. I stood in the doorway and called out to him. For the first time in my life, I felt some type of concern for his well-being. He slowly turned around to face me, the rain cascading down his withered face. His eyes displayed an emotion beyond sadness, more like broken. I could clearly now see it was blood on his shirt, presumably my mother's. He must have found out about the affairs. Maybe one of them were still hiding in the walls. My father locked eyes with me, not turning away for a second. And through the endless drops of rain, I could still see tears slipping down his cheeks. And that's when he told me the words that would stick with me for the rest of my life. The devil strips us of our humanity, and all that remains is an animal. He then revealed what he was holding, and it didn't take much to realize it was his gun. He aimed it up to the side of his head, and bang! After both my parents were gone, I didn't hesitate. I didn't bother phoning for the police. Instead, I left that night, afraid their spirits would follow me. I wandered the streets for a few months, eating out of trash cans and begging for money. I got to see how much the devil had torn through our community, how fractured human nature really was. I saw grown men fighting over food, women, and worse, drugs. The mere sight disturbed me. Eventually, I found a job in the only thing my father ever taught me. I became an electrician, slowly building up the skill that was gifted to me. It took me a few years, but I found steady work at a small company that was willing to give me a chance. And by some miracle, my life fell into place. Though I had no friends, nor did I want any. I was perfectly satisfied being alone. One thing I took with me before leaving was my blue dress. And by this point, I was too big to put it on. But I would caress the tattered fabric between my fingers anytime I felt the pressures of the world trying to consume me. It was cathartic. As I entered my mid-20s, I had no desire in meeting women. I was still a virgin. Though, for whatever reason, women seemed to love me. They told me they admired my resolve when it came to my opinions, how manly I was. They threw around words like rugged and confident. I didn't care. I told them that I wasn't interested, that all I ever saw was my mother when looking at them. But they didn't give up easily. Eventually, I lost my virginity to a girl named Sandra. She was after me for months. The premise made me sick. She was an animal. And because of that, I treated her like one. The night she took my virginity, I mimicked the same noises that I heard coming from my mother's room those days she would invite her friends over. I squealed and grunted, letting go of all my anger. And eventually, when I looked at Sandra laying beneath me, stunned and tired, I saw my mother's face. After that encounter, that's when my night terrors came back. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. A sudden bang exploding in my dreams shook me awake. It didn't take long to realize I wasn't alone in the room. The old familiar sound of heavy breathing encapsulated my hearing. I looked to each corner ready to see him. It only took me a few turns, but quickly I saw its massive silhouette standing in the corner, just staring at me. I was now a grown man. I wasn't going to let some shadow frighten me. And promptly, I got out of bed and walked towards it. As I approached the dark figure, I was ready to do whatever it took for it to leave me alone. I clenched my fist tightly, preparing myself to strike like some lion in the jungle. But before I could even raise my arm, the demon did what had always terrified me. And that was, it smiled. The monster then began to walk towards me. Its movements mangled like some broken marionette. The closer it got to me, it grew, increasing its dominance over me, while its smiling grin only terrifying me more. And like some small child, I ran back to my bed. I hid under the covers and reached my hand under the mattress, grabbing at my blue dress, draping it over me, trying my best to calm as that thing snorted and paraded around the room as if it were dancing, celebrating its victory over me. These occurrences only continued as time passed, though I didn't let the monster conquer me. Instead, I lived life the only way I knew how, like an animal. I would bring women home almost on a daily basis, fulfilling my carnal impulses. I could always feel the presence of the entity in the room with us, savoring each minute of pure animal lust. My worldview quickly came into perspective. I realized that human nature had been lost, that the devil had stripped us of our humanity. And like my father had said, we were all now just animals. It made sense. The social veneer of kindness and empathy was all a ruse, pretending to be something that we weren't. The homeless man walking around pleading for money was more in touch with themselves than the person driving around their electric vehicle, preaching false platitudes. I was disgusted with how people pretended. Only in bed did I see the real person come to life. The women I would lie with took pleasure in my carnal desires, where they enjoyed squealing and moaning with me. It didn't take long for me to voice my opinions. Initially, it was just me talking to some of my coworkers, and quickly I saw how engulfed they were in what I was saying. It was almost like someone had lit a light bulb in their dormant minds. The more I talked about my point of view, the more people wanted to listen. Soon, my audience went from coworkers to their friends. People importuned for me to write a book or some article. Unfortunately, my writing skills were a bit poor. After all, my homeschooling experience was more of a facade to keep me isolated away from the other children. So, I did what I think most people do these days, and that is, I started a podcast. It's funny how virility functions. One piece of information is passed between friends, then acquaintances, and eventually strangers. My words were being spread around the globe like some new age of enlightenment. People found value in my words. I became a bit of a local celebrity, hosting small lectures, teaching my listeners on the value of accepting our nature, our biological nature. My audience mainly consisted of young men who were disenfranchised by the modern world, just like I was. I told them that we were animals, and that animals don't ask for permission. We just take. We consume at our leisure. It became one of my mottos. If you want it, then take it. Anytime I had a rally, I could always feel its presence looking on, its ominous grin showering me in its web of madness. Or perhaps it were smiling at all of us. Visions of it snorting uncontrollably invaded my mind. I would catch a glimpse of it in the audience, its dark figure any some small crevice of the crowd. I came to realize whatever this thing was, it seemed to be proud of me. Eventually, my audience grew to a massive size, filling a stadium of thousands. My followers wanted me to run for office. Which office, I asked them, and they would reply it didn't matter. The adulation I had achieved was beyond gratifying. But it was during one of my rallies did things take a turn for the worse. I was midway finishing some point I had about how we can't escape our biology, when I heard one of my audience members yell out my all too familiar motto, "If you want it, then take it." I raised my hand in a gesture of agreement, smiling. But then more of them started saying the same mantra. I tried to calm the young men, but they couldn't stop. They all started chanting the words over and over again, the voices unifying to a dire level of frequency. I had to clench my hands over my ears as I did my best to calm the frenzy that was unfolding before me. And soon their simple chants transformed to hideous moans. Moans that sounded all too familiar. The sounds of those days my mother would bring her friends home. I looked around the stadium. I could see the young men beating their chests, hooting and grunting, pouncing around like animals. Brawls broke out. I could hear the clashes of fist meeting bone, breaking and cracking, skin tearing, blood flowing. It became a ghastly scene. I stood frozen, not knowing what I was witnessing. What was I supposed to do? The hollering settled as most of the sound became whimpers and sobbing. By the end of the event, the crowd were nothing more than mangled piles of blood and flesh, scattered bones laid in ruins, and I felt the sudden urge to vomit. That's when I saw it in the middle of the chaotic aftermath. Its dominating stature standing at tallest I've ever seen it. Its grin larger than any animal. And like always, it began to snort. I ran out of the stadium, terrified, needing to escape, feeling how I felt all those years ago when I would dream about leaving my horrid existence. And for the moment, I fantasized of entering Wonderland to find refuge from whatever this was. As I frantically sprinted towards my car, I saw a couple of guys moving around erratically, unnaturally, and when they saw me, they started grunting. Soon they were chasing me, making the most grotesque sounds, pounding their chests. I could see pure rage in their eyes. By some miracle, I made it to my vehicle before they had a chance to grab me, and I quickly peeled out of there. As I drove around my small city, I saw more lunacy, more depravity. Men were engaging in acts of violence, while the women flaunting around their bodies, displaying their sexuality. I was at a loss for words, and that's when I came to a small tribe of men. They were surrounding something, groaning, and it didn't take long to realize what the object was. It was a young woman. They had her trapped. I honked my horn, hoping the men would disperse, but they gave me no attention. I contemplated if I should just leave. Instead, an act of courage embodied me. I needed this to end. I reached into my glove compartment, then got out of my car. I approached closer. I could see they were about to take the woman's innocence. She was still normal. I yelled out to them to stop, that this was not the way, that we were more than just animals. But all I got in return were dead stares, glazed eyes that were empty of any resemblance of humanity. I pointed my gun. Tears filled my eyes as I knew what had to be done. The only thing that could be done. Bang! I escaped the city. Me and my new friend. She is traumatized, and I couldn't blame her. I do my best to comfort her, telling her that everything will be okay. Her name is Alice. It took several miles, passing streets of pure evil and debauchery, but eventually I was able to leave. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see it leering at me, still grinning, all too pleased with what was unraveling. Humanity. The government quarantined the zone, fencing off the entire city, leaving the people to fend for themselves in the animal kingdom. You probably heard about it in the news. Something about a new outbreak. How the country's trying to contain it before it spreads. Well, it was my words. It's too late. And that thing is all too happy. I was wrong. We are more than just our biology. We are people. Souls that have compassion and love. Though, perhaps it might be too late. The devil has stripped us of our humanity, and all that remains is an animal. Hi guys. As usual, thank you for listening to my story, and if you like what you heard, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. So please let me know, how can I improve this channel? Is it the stories? Is it my production? Just give me any suggestions how I can make this a more enjoyable experience for everyone. So I know this story was a lot darker than most stories I do. I don't know. I see some content about the red pill community and how they always want to bring up that we are our biology, which is true, but we are more than that. There's a lot of nuance to us. We have empathy and compassion. We have interests. We align with each other in different ways. We find communities through strength and resemblance. So I don't like the notion that we are just our biology, And that's what kind of inspired the story, because I feel like that talk is dangerous. When you limit us to our biology, then it's easy to find out who's our enemies. And I don't like that rhetoric. Anyway, so, like I said, if you like the story, let me know. And I think that's it for now, guys. So I will see you in the next video. Alrighty, guys. Bye.